Yeah, you're welcome to the polling station. It's day three since Freedom Day launched a new Britain, a new UK, and I'm very interested from Ireland to hear how this is going for William Kedjanyi and everyone. And is there a bit of an influence in terms of polling? Because we have a Servation poll, which actually shows that Labour is doing quite well. We also have Dominic Cummings, who's never out of the news, as a Laurie just goes by me there. The Dominic Cummings interview with Laura Kuenssberg, never less than entertaining. Big Dom, we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about the front of Private Eye, Freedom Day gamble. Boris Johnson, are you sure this is a good idea? And the Health Secretary responds, I'm positive. I guess that's a good way to start. The polling station. William Kedjanyi, how are you?
I am good. I am free as I've ever been, and today I did test myself with lateral flow, and it thankfully came back negative. There's the PCR test in the post going somewhere if hopefully I can find the security seal. So yeah, I'm fully engaged with all of the viral discourse.
All of the viral discourse. I like that. Let's actually start with Servation's latest public polling, which took place 19th to 20th of July, which sees an 11-point Conservative lead a week ago cut to just 4 points. And this comes around the time of that by-election, obviously, that went Labour's way. Conservative lost a couple of by-elections, actually, over the past month or 6 weeks or whatever. This is interesting because, obviously, these are really, really fascinating times in Britain. There's a hell of a lot going on, but Sir Keir Starmer's position from a month ago, he seems to be in a much brighter place very, very quickly, underlining that, a week is a long time in politics.
Recently, he's had some things to take advantage of. I wouldn't necessarily say that he was automatically in a better place, but things such as the 2 hours and 13 minutes of chaos when it seemed as if Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak were going to be on a pilot scheme to avoid self-isolation before they weren't after the public outcry. Things like that all help, as do the Cummings media attacks,
revelations, as it were.
Yeah, revelations, as it were. Things like that do help him. I think he's at his best when he's able to make the hypocrisy arguments. But I'd be interested to see what happens with other polls through the week. The Servation one is interesting. I'm inclined to believe it's an outlier for the moment, but we have to wait and see. The government's getting into a tricky phase of pandemic management. They have released all restrictions. It's a big gap, and a big decision into the NHS. You have this. You have this sort of tolerance basically within the NHS for things to go wrong. The key is basically, what does the NHS find tolerable? What does tolerable look like? Because it looks very different in different places of the country. I'm lucky I'm in the southwest here. In the northwest, there are problems. In London, it's looking that way too. But to go back to the original point, Starmer has been given some opportunities. I think it's not unfair to say that he and the Labour Party have missed quite a few. I felt decent today at PMQs in pushing Johnson, but this happens with him every other week, and it seems not to move the dial all that much.
It's obviously a gamble. The whole loosening of restrictions is a gamble on every level, but how much of a political gamble is it for Boris?
A very big one as well, because like we had last year, if the scientific data gets so dire that his advisors, Sage, with Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, tell him he has to go back, and B, if people start self-isolating and coming back into their shells anyway, which is what happened with lockdowns 1 and 2, people began to stay home because they didn't trust that going out was safe, then it will be devastating, because there's a sizable enough amount of people in this country who I think are absolutely done with any sort of restrictions. I think there are a large amount of people who are basically absolutely done with things like social distancing, done with things like mask wearing, done with things like not being able to go and see who they like when they like. In a future lockdown, if you had one, I'm hypothetically speaking, the government would take a hit, I'm quite sure, at broken promises, and also from a large group of people who have, for the last 18 months or so, been living under varying levels of restrictions, including, of course, full lockdowns, at least in the British sense, for several weeks at a time.
Okay, so let's move on to a man who obviously flouted lockdown guidelines, in Dominic Cummings, and this interview with the BBC's Laura Kuenssberg. So Cummings has been in the news a lot now for the past, whatever, month, 6 weeks, various leaks, trying to undermine Boris Johnson, trying to undermine much of the cabinet. He's kind of backtracked a bit on Brexit, even though I guess, you know, he's made the point that nobody can tell if this is going to work out or not. And I think, in fairness, you can't argue with him on that. But what did you make of this whole interview? It's long, it's lengthy, and it's always entertaining when DC's involved.
Having watched it once and listened to it once, I think the interview is interesting. I think it is a compelling watch, whether you like it or not. I was certainly interested enough in what he got to say to watch it comfortably for now and then to listen to the different parts of it, albeit that I'm somebody who's quite into these things. The viewer ratings for it were good. It was 1.6 million on BBC Two last night, which was 12% of the audience watching. You'd expect typically 5%, I think, according to Patrick Maguire of Redbox from the Times. So it had the desired effect for the BBC. Some of the things that he said we knew about already. I think that's also been the case with some of his Substack claims and some of his tweets. There were things that we knew about already. Other bits were quite interesting. I have to admit, I was a bit taken aback at the claim that he tried to, or people are trying to get rid of Boris Johnson just a few days into the job. You know, just for two reasons, right? Firstly, number one, if you want to take down a political figure or whatever, generally speaking, you engineer a moment of weakness and then you go then. Right? Like, for instance, with Hancock, you know, that's
weak at
how
the knees, as it were.
Yeah. You don't really go for them after they've had their big victory. You generally speaking, like, it's an odd time to decide that somebody isn't fit for the job and that you want to go and consider removing them. I mean, how would you have done it? The guy has just gone and given the Conservatives, you know, nearly an 80-seat majority. It's the biggest since Blair. He'd be the most powerful figure if he was fully concentrated, then Blair, basically. So that was really odd to me. And secondly, the way people have reacted to it and the way Cummings has presented it himself makes it look as if he was taken aback by how bad Johnson is. Personal opinion there. But let's say by how bad he found Johnson. But anybody who's been paying even the remote, like even a remote bit of attention, even the slightest bit of attention to Johnson's record as Foreign Secretary would already know all this for a fact. Now, Cummings didn't work with Johnson then, but I struggle to believe that somebody so well connected wouldn't be aware of his faults and shortcomings. So to me, that was quite odd. And I mean, I don't doubt that he probably did take a dislike to him or did find him incompetent, but to me, it seemed very strange that he didn't already know. But he's already explained at length why he supported Johnson, etc., etc. And it didn't surprise me to hear basically him saying that we felt we could control Johnson.
Do you find him disingenuous?
Yeah, in some parts, in quite large parts. You have to take everything with a grain of salt that he says. I don't doubt that there are some of the things that he said there were true. Certainly everything he said about lockdowns has been borne out by evidence, either in the decisions that the government took or in the WhatsApps that he's given. But there were also, I think, plenty of claims which were really quite odd and disingenuous. He said apparently that he didn't feel much emotion at the end of the Brexit referendum, which is just plainly not true, because I have, like many other people, I've seen a video of him punching through the office ceiling at Vote Leave headquarters in the after referendum, little bits like that. The Barnard Castle story I didn't think stood up again, even his revived version. He said he had serious security problems. I could understand that. He's a high profile public figure. Plenty of people didn't like him. Wouldn't surprise me that he's had an issue with security. Not that I'm saying I condone any of that behavior, but not a surprise. But he was meant to be in deep discussion with the Cabinet Office and all over this, and yet somehow it fell to him to drive his family up to Barnard Castle. That surprises me. It surprises me that he didn't have the sort of arrangements that I think Sajid Javid, when he became Home Secretary, got a whole new set of upgrades at his house. I think Starmer also had that after he became leader of the opposition. Like, generally speaking, high-profile figures working for the government tend to have advanced security detail. I'm a bit perplexed as to how Cummings didn't seem to. That's not to rubbish the claims that he and his family were feeling the heat. Just broadly, a couple of other takeaways I noticed from it. To me, it confirmed my view that the government is built essentially as a campaign machine, and it's filled full of people who don't have the interest or the expertise in governing. And also, it confirmed to me that I think, aside from Brexit, which is not necessarily, I think, something the government knows how to execute because it hasn't really been done before. It's difficult really to get coherent big aims, right? We know HS2 is being built. We know that levelling up is a supposed target, but levelling up is different things to different people. And bar that, it's difficult to think of much else that's gone on, because the government's had one big task. It's been the pandemic. And I think many people would say that they failed at that task.
Yeah, Brexit's another task, obviously, and you referenced it there. There's obviously been a bit of a to and fro and again over the agreements in terms of Northern Ireland and so forth, and the Irish Sea border and all that. We also had a really controversial suggestion from Boris, reiterated again last week, that there would be an amnesty for effectively for murders and trouble. So Northern Ireland very much in the news, and this is in a strange way that the amnesty issue has kind of united parties, more or less united parties in the north. And for me, I think a lot of people in the north would look at the Irish government stance in this and think it more favourable than the government's, which effectively you could read into it that the British government has some dirty secrets with regard to Northern Ireland, and Boris doesn't want these out there.
Yeah, I mean, I could absolutely see how people would believe that. These arguments over the protocol, again, they suggest a sort of lack of foresight to me on behalf of the UK government. They seem to be very mad about something that they signed, that they wrote. Lord Frost, who wrote this command document explaining sort of the UK stance after Brandon Lewis was in the Commons speaking about it, has all the air of a man who he looks like he's trying to get out of iTunes terms and agreements and conditions. Like, that's what it looks like to me, just trying basically to draw back from something that he signed, that he's negotiated. And I think, again, for the rest of this year, you're going to see that pressure increase. There was an interview today with somebody from Marks and Spencer's on the Today programme, basically explaining already that there are big knock-on effects in terms of the items that can be brought into stores, and that bits are already going off the Christmas calendar because they can't get through customs. Brexit was a decision made in a referendum, although that referendum had been building for a long time. But the effects will be over quite a few years, and they might build up in some cases to be something quite nasty. It just very much depends on where your outlook is and where you are in the political and social chain, and also where you live. And in Northern Ireland, I think we could see some problems down the road.
Well, you're not wrong there, yeah. And yeah, the point has been made. Obviously, Northern Ireland didn't vote for Brexit. What for me is actually really alarming is how many people actually did vote for Brexit in Northern Ireland. Maybe they'd no regard for border communities, whatever, in Northern Ireland. But anyway, that's for another day. Maybe people just want out of the EU. I don't know. We'll see what happens. Let's briefly go over to the States, because there was a report from the leading association of pollsters confirming how wrong the 2020 election polls were. And infuriatingly, 9 months after that close to unexpected contest, the people are the reasons why are still looking for answers. So this survey of the contest and survey into the, I suppose, analysis of the polls, why they were so wrong. And we'll all remember this, you know, Joe Biden's lead in this the whole way basically through into the election was way stronger than was implied by the betting market. So something wasn't quite right. Now, this report has looked into why the poll got it wrong. But unfortunately, William, it doesn't really give any clear answer. It kind of says why these are reasons that weren't the reason why the poll was wrong. But it's still a little bit vague, and you're kind of left looking for more answers, maybe, and a little bit more confused than you were at the outset.
So yeah, this is a really, I think it's a really important report, especially for political pundits and also punters, and also a report that many pollsters will find quite worrying, because 4 years ago it was generally assumed that the main reason why polls didn't necessarily, although I've always contended that the polls were not really far wrong in 2016, but the main reason why people didn't really see a Trump victory coming was because of a weighting problem when it came to education, and the fact that polls weren't picking up that plenty of people were voting for Trump who didn't have college degrees or whatever.
Yeah.
So a lot of those adjustments were made over the last 4 years. I think there'll be some rather dispirited faces to see that these polls were 3.9 points too favourable to Biden, whilst the state polls were even further out. With the state polls, I should also just add, generally speaking, it's much harder to poll local state races. It is always harder to poll locally. There's always a bit more uncertainty with it. And that's what I've found, at least, when looking at these things, whether it be by-elections over here or local elections as a set. We did those back early this year, always been a bit harder to poll locally. But nationally, it will worry pollsters. Now, again, interestingly, most of the error, again, came from underestimating Trump's support compared to overestimating Biden's.
But they couldn't really explain why. That was the issue. So it's like, are people lying? No, we don't think they are.
Well, apparently Republicans aren't responding to surveys because they think they're fake news. I wouldn't be surprised if that was playing a part in it, and you were just getting Democrat overrepresentation, which, to be fair, some people were saying would be an issue before the election. I must admit I didn't believe them at the time. And also, another point on the we don't know why part that I found really interesting, no big differences between polls conducted on the phone or over the internet or using a mix of all the various ways you can contact people, which will, I think, be rather unsettling for pollsters. But potentially an opportunity for political punters if the market follows the polls as closely as they have done in recent years.
What else have we got this week?
Two bits from the continent. The presidential election in France next year is coming closer and closer. Before you know it, really, it will be on top of us. And in the latest polling of polls from Politico, Macron and Le Pen are neck and neck.
Oh my God.
With Bertrand, they've both got 25% of the vote. Bertrand has 17. Now, Macron has just made a very big power play in France by essentially mandating vaccine passports for pretty much everything. You can test if you want to, but it's €49 now for a PCR, and I think 29 for an antigen. Bookings have rocketed up a bit recently, 3 million, I think, in the last week, but there's also pretty fierce opposition. French uptake of the vaccine had been good. It'd been pretty strong. It was about 70% or so. Macron's really wanted to kick that a bit higher, and it will be a fascinating experiment to see how it goes. The test over there, also here with our passports, although they come in later in September, presumably that's to get more 18 to 35-year-olds to have 2 doses before then. And also it will be, I think, a pretty big test of people's willingness to go that far to come back to normality. The reason why I'm talking about all this for an election a year away is because from what we've seen, the best hope you can have for COVID is for it to be endemic. So it's a big public health test too. Does this work in combating Delta and reducing rates? If so, does Macron get the credit for that? And if not, do things go the other way? Because there's more than enough anti-vaccination sentiment, and there's more than enough pro-libertarian sentiment for a move like this to backfire big time. We will learn over the next month, but I think that'll be really important. Macron is 4-6 with us. Le Pen is 3-1, which some people might think is big, considering they're neck and neck, but the runoffs have favoured Macron. But that race is already looking really tight. And in Germany, because 2 weeks ago we were talking about the influence of climate change on political betting, well, they had those horrible floods, and it's proven to be a big test for Armin Laschet, who's the front runner to be Chancellor when Angela Merkel exits centre stage. However, he does not have as strong a Green record as, well, predictably, the Green Party. Plenty have been criticising him for it. He doesn't think that the floods are a excuse to advance, basically, the ditching of coal in Germany. And whilst the gap has been widening between the CDU and the Greens, nothing is going to throw the climate back into the forefront of the picture, then unfortunately a tragedy like this took place there. So
I imagine it'll have like real shocking repercussions in Germany, because it was such a large scale event, and you know, climate change is climate change, whatever. But I guess when it hits home in such a developed country, which would be relatively immune to climate change in terms of catastrophic stuff like you see in, you know, Canada this month, and obviously China as well, with like utterly horrific flooding there, and basically a heat wave across much of the world at the moment. But in Germany, from my perspective, if you're not green, you're going to lose in the long term, and this might have repercussions, obviously, in Germany.
Yeah, it might do, and you know, the green agenda is already moving in places. Some people will say it needs to move faster. Wouldn't disagree with them at all, but it's already making its stamp in electoral politics. That will only increase over time. It'll be interesting to see whether events like that really put it forefront and center. The Greens already had quite a big standing in Germany, even though they were quite well behind the CDU. Interestingly, there has been some talk apparently, and this was something Keir Starmer faced as well, about the backlash for being seen to play politics during a national tragedy. So that will also be something to watch as well. Do the Greens get a bit of blowback for stating their case this time? They weren't rushing down to the scene either, noticeably. But that's definitely something to look out for, because unfortunately we're only seeing more and more extreme weather events, and we already have COP26 in the UK later this year, and it looks very much as if within the next 2 or 3 years, certainly with the next election cycles, in most places where you can bet, that climate change will have a bigger role to play than it did last time.
I think what will be key is, and I have actually wondered about this. There's an episode of The Simpsons where Lisa finds out that Jebediah Springfield is a fraud, but she goes in front of the masses, and she's about to tell the whole town that Jebediah Sprinkle is a fraud. But she sees that everyone is in such good form. She says, well, actually, says herself, the myth is actually more important than the truth. So I'm just going to go along with the lie and just say he was great. I think we could come to a time where scientists will be so alarmed that things are so bad, they might be kind of advising themselves to say, well, we have to put a positive spin on this, because otherwise people will just give up. And like, it really could be that bad in the next 5 or 10 years, where you've literally cherries in Canada melting on the top while they're in their trees because it's so hot. And I don't know. I think it's alarming times. But if governments don't go along with this, I do think they will. I think they will be punished at the polls. I do believe that, because it's going to be in your face every so often now. There's going to be a climate catastrophe.
Yeah. I mean, also there could be an element of hopelessness in terms of what can individual people do, really, to combat it, because governments have to lead the way. And how governments present that message is going to be very different from one country to the next, depending on the leader, right? Some are clearly more conscious. I'm taking two different ends of the stick here, but Biden is much more climate aware than Trump was before him, or at least in his messaging he is. Jacinda Ardern is much more climate aware than Boris Johnson. I can imagine, say, a Merkel or a Macron being much more aware of it. I mean, France implemented that rule, cutting down on inter-country travel by airplane. So you can already see different changes in governments. And I think it's just something for political bettors to think about, because if there's one thing I think I could say I've learned from my time doing this, is that big issues decide elections, sometimes even more than the campaigns.
Make the climate work.
Couldn't put it any fairer than that.
William, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for yours.
Yeah, that was the polling station with Star Sports. We got through a lot there, obviously. Dominic Cummings and the looking into the polls in the States, and what might happen to Boris. Maybe a bit of a spurt in hope for Keir Starmer. Climate change, Northern Ireland, Germany, in some sort of order, and we'll be back next week.